You know how it is you're keen to really understand something complex, to get the full picture without feeling like you're drowning in information? That's exactly what we aim for here. Today, we're diving into a pretty compelling subject: how music has been used throughout history as a way to heal.
It really is fascinating. And the material we've been looking at gives this incredibly expansive view. I mean, we're talking ideas about music and healing that stretch back millennia. Yeah. Across a huge range of cultures and approaches.
Yeah, and something that immediately caught my attention in one of the main books was, well, how much focus is given to the older historical periods? Even to what might seem like quite specific things, like Tarantism in Italy, while the more recent centuries, relatively speaking, get less page space.
Right.
And it's not just some random quirk of the book. It actually suggests that the history of music therapy more recently is, well, maybe more intricate and perhaps less thoroughly examined than you might think.
That's a really significant observation, I think. It reminds us that this relationship between music and healing isn't just some simple straight line forward. There have been times of intense interest, real development, and then periods where maybe the topic was just less prominent in, say, medical circles or scholarly discussion.
So our goal today, our mission, if you like, is to pull out the most important ideas from this really rich history. We want to see the common threads in how different eras understood and used music for healing. We want to pinpoint those moments of big change in thinking, but also the ideas that seem to stick around all while, keeping the discussion focused and not getting lost in every single detail.
Okay, so where should we begin to unpack this?
Well, I think a natural starting point would be to think about why that period after 1800 seems, according to our sources anyway, less comprehensively explored in music therapy history. It feels a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it, given all the advances in medicine and music since then? Exactly. You'd naturally expect more recent history to be better documented, clearer. But a key reason, it seems, for this comparative lack of focus is that this period doesn't really line up with one single dominant way of thinking about health and music.
Right.
Not like earlier times, like antiquity or the Renaissance, which had more, unified frameworks.
Yeah, if you look at the bigger picture of medical history, you see this major shift happening around then. By the early 19th century, that ancient humoral theory of medicine.
The four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that whole thing.
Exactly that. From Hippocrates and Galen, hugely influential for centuries, what was really starting to lose its grip. The scientific revolution had challenged it, of course, but its influence, it lingered for a very long time.
Okay, so this long-held idea that illness came from an imbalance of bodily fluids was fading. But what new understanding of how music might affect health was replacing it? That's the question, isn't it?
That really is the central issue. Because the other major framework, the professionalization of music therapy as its own field, that really only cemented itself after World War II. And while this more recent era gives us tools for comparing practices globally, which is great, there's also a potential bias, isn't there, towards Western or first world perspectives. We could end up overlooking more traditional forms if we're not careful.
Yeah. It sounds like there's this transitional phase, this period of flux maybe, where connecting the ideas of different thinkers about music and therapy is just trickier. It seems our sources are kind of charting this less explored territory.
Precisely. And navigating this transition, looking at the emergence of modern British music therapy in the early 20th century gives us a useful anchor point.
Right, and this is where it gets particularly interesting. Our sources mention Canon Frederick Kill Harford in the early 1900s, who had this, frankly, quite innovative idea of piping music to patients over the telephone. That seems incredibly out of its time.
It really does. Harford seems like a bit of an outlier, maybe, but his idea definitely foreshadows the role technology would later play. But the real push toward establishing music therapy as a profession in Britain came later, post-World War II, with key figures like Juliet Alvin making really significant contributions.
Alvin, right. She was crucial in building that academic foundation for music therapy, getting it recognized as a legitimate professional discipline, wasn't she?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She played a huge role in defining its principles, its methods. And what's quite striking, actually, is the contrast our sources draw between contemporary music therapy and these earlier approaches.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's pretty common to see people in therapy just, engaging in spontaneous musical expression, maybe improvising, even if the sounds they make wouldn't have traditionally been called music.
That's a massive departure because it seems like in earlier times, a certain level of musical skill was often assumed, right? Whether you were singing, playing, or just listening properly. Now, the focus seems much more on the therapeutic process itself, the expressing of emotions, kind of regardless of technical ability.
That's right. The very definition of what counts as music in a therapeutic setting has broadened out massively. Someone living in Europe before, say, the mid-20th century might have heard sounds from some modern sessions and thought that was a sign of illness, not healing.
Okay, so we're seeing a real evolution here in how music's understood and used. Now let's shift gears slightly. One of the more maybe unexpected things to find in a historical look at music therapy is the inclusion of shamanistic traditions.
Yeah, and it's important to be clear here. Our sources aren't really presenting shamanism like a current ethnographic study of a specific culture. Instead, they're looking at its historical association in Western thought with things like trance, ecstasy, connecting with the spirit world, all within the context of musical healing practices.
Right, it gets framed as this ancient, almost primal way of using music, doesn't it? To induce altered states, connect with something beyond the everyday. Mircea Eliade's work, his idea of archaic techniques of ecstasy, seems relevant here.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And even offense like Orpheus from Greek myth, the ultimate musician with incredible power.
Yeah.
There's speculation about shamanistic roots there, too. Some historical views even suggest this long line from prehistoric shamanism to more recent rituals. So the shaman figure has definitely occupied a place in Western ideas about musical healing.
But our sources also stress the need for, well, nuance when historians talk about shamanism. The perspective from Korea, for instance, where practitioners are typically women, kind of challenges some standard ideas. It seems we need to be careful not to oversimplify that whole category.
Absolutely. Now, moving into the 19th century, our sources suggest that just looking at the general history of medicines doesn't really give you the full picture of music's therapeutic role then. Instead, we need to look at two big interconnected cultural trends: Romanticism and the rise of institutional psychiatry.
Romanticism, okay, that whole era of intense emotion, valuing individual expression, fascination with the inner self. How did that feed into ideas about music and healing?
Well, Romantic musical thought really shifted the focus. The 18th century was more about, say, imitation, rational structures in music. Romanticism was all about the expressive power of the individual genius. Romantic music was seen as bubbling up from the composer's deepest feelings, and having this profound impact on the listener's inner world. This idea of composers being touched by this inspired, almost irrational genius.
And the music itself was thought to have incredible power, right? Didn't Wagner think his opera, Tristan and Isolde, if performed intensely enough, could actually, break people's minds?
That's the story, yes. Exactly. And on a more philosophical level, Romantic music was elevated. It was seen as going beyond the physical, reaching something deeper. The philosopher Schopenhauer, for instance, argued music was unique among the arts. It could directly access what he called the will, the underlying force of everything.
Wow. So music in the Romantic era was this incredibly potent force, but it also had this double edge, didn't it? It could apparently cause psychological distress, what they called insanity back then, but also maybe heal it.
That's exactly right. You get accounts of composers like Liszt causing almost hysterical reactions in audiences, especially women. It sounds a bit like the frenzy around pop stars today, actually.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Liszt also visited mental asylums and played for patients there. So cause and cure, right there in one figure.
Which leads us neatly to the other big development, the growth of asylums, institutional psychiatry. How did music fit into that picture?
Well, surprisingly, perhaps, from the late 18th century onwards, music became a fairly common thing inside many asylums. Now, you might think initially this was just part of the old Galenic idea of diet, a daily routine, including entertainment to keep emotions balanced. But the thinking behind it had actually changed quite a bit.
Because Galenic medicine saw mental illness as mainly physical, right? Even if emotions played a part. And cocking therapies weren't really a thing then. Early asylum treatment was more about managing the body, the behavior.
Yes, the initial focus wasn't always deeply psychological. But then you get this shift with the rise of moral management or moral therapy in some of the more forward-thinking asylums. This approach emphasized psychological interventions over just tying people down. It viewed mental illness as more of a failure of reason that could be addressed through, well, rational and humane treatment.
And within that new framework, music pops up again as a potential healing tool in asylums, which is interesting because its use for actual cure had been pretty much absent since the early Middle Ages, maybe apart from some monasteries.
Exactly. And this renewed interest also happened alongside music becoming more important in society generally.
Hmm.
Commercial leisure, bourgeois social life. Music was becoming a bigger part of what was seen as a normal, fulfilling life.
Our sources specifically mention the Illinois Asylum in Germany, studied by Kramer, as a place where music really seemed to shape the whole community vibe. Apparently, their understanding of the soul even had musical ideas in it.
Yes, they talked about the Gemüth, the soul, having a natural rhythm, almost echoing that medieval idea of musica humana. And they even saw mental disorders as a kind of arrhythmia that music, in a broad sense, could potentially treat.
So Germany seems like a real hotspot for exploring music's therapeutic side, tied in with romanticism and early psychiatry. Okay, what about across the Atlantic? How did things look in early America?
That's important to look at, yeah, especially since the early histories of American and British music therapy were kind of tangled up in the early 20th century. So to get the American picture, we need to look at some of the earliest writings from North America.
And it sounds like those first writings, late 18th century, were pretty traditional, still leaning heavily on those old Galenic ideas about the mind-body connection being really close. There's mention of a 1789 article arguing against newer physiological theories that seem to downplay music's potential therapeutic effects.
Yes, and you also find some early anecdotal reports like a dancer supposedly cured of depression, or a music teacher whose fever went down during performances in 1796. Interesting stories, but quite isolated.
Then, early 1800s, you start seeing medical dissertations showing a bit of a shift in thinking, even if they're still referencing Galen. Like, Attlee argued music could get at the causes of mania, seeing it as a delirious or mistaken idea, not just physical. And Matthews even proposed the ISO principle.
Right, matching the music to the patient's mood.
And recommended music therapy for institutions.
But what's really noticeable about these early American writers is they seem to have had pretty limited hands-on experience with actually using music therapy. They relied a lot on classical medical texts. It was more theoretical exploration than reporting widespread practice.
And Benjamin Rush, a major figure in early American psychiatry, big on moral therapy. You'd think he'd be a champion for music therapy.
You would, wouldn't you? And that's where it's a bit surprising. While Rush definitely supported moral treatment, his backing for music therapy just wasn't as strong as you might expect. He was much more enthusiastic about physical things, like his tranquilizing chair. When he did mention music, it was often quite brief, general. Or he was reporting what other people had observed, not his own direct advocacy.
So the arrival of moral treatment in America, which you'd think would create a good environment for music therapy, maybe it was a bit of a mixed blessing in terms of actual impact on the field?
That seems a fair way to put it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the first clearly documented institutional use of music in the U.S. wasn't even in a hospital or asylum. It was at the Perkins School for the Blind in 1832. But the main goal there was more about intellectual gratification, social integration, rather than direct therapy for mental or emotional issues.
And it seems after that initial flurry in the early 1800s, things went quiet on the music therapy front in American medical journals for quite a while, until the 1870s.
That's right. Then you see a renewed interest, people asserting its potential again. There were even some government-sponsored experiments in a New York asylum in 1878.
Okay.
And by the 1890s, you have some figures explicitly linking music therapy back to moral treatment principles, even though that approach itself was starting to fade. You also get early attempts at systematic investigation, like Cummings' work, using romantic music to try and lift patients' depression by linking pleasant feelings during drowsiness to waking hours. This really sets the scene for the early 20th century and the really significant work done by women like Eva Vesalius and Margaret Anderton.
It's fascinating tracing these threads, seeing how things emerge, sometimes fade, then eventually build towards the more formal field we know today. Okay, let's turn now to something a bit less conventional, but historically really intriguing. The connection between music therapy and occult or esoteric beliefs.
Yes, this is a captivating side of the story that often gets overlooked. When we talk about occultism, we generally mean beliefs in hidden properties of nature, things you can't sense directly, that certain people, adepts, are thought to be able to influence. And it's crucial to remember that historically, the line between what was seen as occult and what was mainstream science wasn't always so clear-cut.
You mentioned two key examples, mesmerism and theosophy. Let's start with mesmerism. I've heard of Franz Anton Mesmer and his animal magnetism theory. How did music come into that?
Right. Mesmer, who was actually a physician and musically gifted, proposed this universal fluid, animal magnetism, that he believed flowed through everything and influenced health. His ideas kind of blended Renaissance cosmology, planetary influence, and all that with Enlightenment science, which had its own theories about universal fluids. For Mesmer, illness wasn't about humoral imbalance, but a blockage or disorder in these magnetic forces, which could be corrected using magnets or later just his hands.
Okay, so the treatment involved magnets or hands. Where did the music fit in?
While Mesmer believed sound could help direct and even strengthen this magnetic fluid. While we don't have specific pieces labeled mesmeric music from his time, music often sung or played on the glass harmonica by Mesmer or piano by an assistant was a constant feature in his quite elaborate therapeutic sessions, his seances.
So the music wasn't necessarily the main healing thing, but more part of setting the stage, creating the right conditions.
That seems to be it. It was part of the whole ritual, helping induce this altered state of receptivity in the patient, maybe focusing the supposed magnetic energy. And it's interesting. Mesmerism, despite facing huge opposition from doctors, became really popular in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. It's a different approach to healing, aiming to provoke a kind of therapeutic crisis, not just suppress symptoms.
It sounds like those seances were almost like performances. And you mentioned a possible link to sexuality in some patients' reactions. The whole thing feels quite complex, maybe a bit alien to our modern therapy ideas.
It really is.
Yeah.
You can see mesmerism as this kind of transitional thing, maybe the end of strict Enlightenment rationalism or the start of something more romantic, more occult influenced. Its cultural impact was pretty big, though. Mozart poked fun at it in Così fan tutte. Even Schubert apparently went to mesmerist sessions. And later thinkers influenced by it even speculated about a sonorous fluid connecting performer and patient.
Wow, quite something. Okay, so that's mesmerism. What about theosophy? That's another name that crops up a lot in these kinds of discussions.
Right, the Theosophical Society, founded by Madame Blavatsky in 1875. They had certain ideas, influenced by Pythagoras, about the inherent power of sound. But using music for therapy wasn't really a central thing in early theosophy. It was more with the second generation, especially Rudolf Steiner and his anthroposophy, or spiritual science, that music took on a much bigger role in this context.
Steiner, right. His name is well known, particularly in education, the Steiner schools. How did his ideas connect with music and healing?
Well, music was really woven into Steiner's whole philosophy. He developed eurythmy, which he saw as a kind of movement that makes music visible. He also had this very musical way of thinking about inner life, suggesting a diseased soul was like an out-of-tune instrument. He drew on Neoplatonic ideas too, like the astral body being a sort of cosmic musician.
And he thought different musical intervals had specific emotional or experiential qualities.
Yes, exactly. He theorized that by working with these intervals, a therapist could potentially help realign the astral body with cosmic harmony, aiming for this holistic healing, artistic and spiritual. And this Steinerian approach has definitely had a lasting impact, influencing certain modern music therapies like Nordhoff and Robbins, and you find it in Steiner-based institutions today.
So even though these esoteric paths might seem a bit unconventional now, they've genuinely left their mark on how some music therapy is actually practiced.
Absolutely. And that leads to a related thought. What about composers themselves? Did modern composers ever see their own music as having a therapeutic or even esoteric purpose?
That's a fascinating angle. You mentioned Scriabin, who had theosophical ideas and planned this massive unfinished work, the Mysterium, like a week-long performance meant to trigger spiritual transformation. That sounds more like a ritual than a concert.
It certainly does. Other composers, like Tippett, saw the composer's role as kind of healing society, often by exploring psychological opposites in their music.
Ah.
And Cyril Scott was explicitly inspired by occult teachings, believing music had hidden influences and healing potential.
And then there's Stockhausen, a major 20th century composer with these really elaborate cosmic ideas, but also a serious interest in professional music therapy. He apparently thought all his music could be therapeutic.
Yes, he had this deep belief in music's power to connect the soul to something beyond, and felt its self-healing potential was massively underestimated. His view kind of brings us full circle, connecting these grand, almost mystical ideas about music's power back to the practical field of music therapy.
This has been such an insightful journey through these historical views. Now, one of our sources spent quite a bit of time looking specifically at the 19th century idea of music as both a cause and a cure for illness. Let's dig into that a bit more, as it seems so central to that era.
Absolutely. Early in the 19th century, even respected physicians like Johann Christian Reil were proposing some really odd devices like the infamous cat piano for treating mental illness. It sounds completely bizarre to us.
Piano made of cats.
Essentially, yes, though probably more theoretical. But it shows this belief that musical stimulation had medicinal effects, mostly kind of psychological rather than purely physical.
Right, so that shift we talked about from the 18th century view linking music mainly to physical sensations to the 19th century romantic idea of musical experience being fundamentally psychological. And this shift really tied music therapy into mental medicine, didn't it?
Exactly. And that connection was both cultural and a direct result of how romantic music felt. The very things about the music that could potentially stir up psychological trouble were also seen as holding the key to calming it down. Music was both toxin and tonic for the mind.
Our sources have some really vivid examples of this split personality. There's that satirical story about Boggs, the clockmaker,
Ah, yes.
driven mad by new music, basically romantic music. It's funny, but also a sharp take on the perceived dangers of this super emotional music.
It is. The way they describe Boggs's breakdown at the concert, it really pulls you into his head, almost like reading a case study of music's psychological impact.
Mhm.
And the fact that one author, Gurris, was a physician, adds weight to the satire.
And it wasn't just fiction, was it? There are those historical accounts of Liszt's concerts, people apparently collapsing into states of mania or melancholy. It really shows how powerful romantic music was felt to be, affecting emotions, even sanity.
Indeed. But paradoxically, the same music seen as potentially causing madness was also being explored as treatment. Leopold Rodnitz, a physician running the Prague Asylum, wrote a book in 1840 about music's positive effects on various mental states, and he dedicated it to Liszt.
That's amazing. Liszt, the supposed source of musical hysteria, was also doing amateur music therapy in Paris hospitals, even seeing positive results with a severely impaired patient at Salpêtrière.
It perfectly illustrates that 19th century view of music as a tool for adjusting psychological states, making it potentially useful for psychiatric intervention in those growing asylums. Figures like Etienne Esquirol in France were also applying music in these settings.
And it wasn't like every asylum did the same thing, was it? Our sources point out real cultural differences in how music was used, comparing places like Naples, Berlin, St. Remy.
Exactly. Germany, being this hub for both romantic music and this kind of speculative music therapy, has some really interesting cases. Peter Lichenthal thought each note had a distinct psychological effect and stressed that you had to listen attentively, be prepared for music to cure you. Peter Joseph Schneider went further, imagining music therapy as a whole specialized medical field within asylum medicine.
Schneider's account of curing a woman's menstrual constipation with a musical fantasy is, well, it's quite something. It sounds almost as intense as Boggs' negative reaction, but therapeutic this time.
It does. And the Ilmenau Asylum in Germany really leaned into music therapy. They had their own choir, brass band, even a special hymn book. They had that idea of the soul as rhythmic and mental illness as arrhythmia treatable by music in a broad sense.
It's important to remember, though, isn't it, that even where music therapy was highly valued, it was still often secondary to the main psychiatric goals. Doctors often approved the music choices, sometimes preferring composers like Mendelssohn for his perceived balance.
Right. And practices were very different outside Germany. In France, sometimes music was used almost like aesthetic restraint. In Britain, it moved beyond just lunatics' balls to include individual playing, musical evenings, even specific compositions for patients like Edward Elgar's work at Powick Asylum. Doctors even use patients' reactions to music to help diagnose them.
So despite all the different applications, there seems to have been this underlying 19th century belief. Musical experience is psychological, but its influence travels almost like a physical force, directly impacting the listener's soul, potentially changing them permanently, depending on various things.
That's a key takeaway. And this close cultural link between music and states of mind, both well and unwell, shows up in literature, too. Like Kleist's story, where intense music causes insanity, or Berlioz's works exploring music's powerful, sometimes disturbing effects even on pianos in his satirical writing.
Now, our sources also spend a good chunk of time on Tarantism in southern Italy. It might seem like a very specific, maybe localized thing, but it gives us this really unique window into music, healing, and cultural beliefs all tangled together.
Tarantism, yeah. With its traditional cure dancing, the tarantella for symptoms thought to come from a tarantula bite. Even though biomedically it's linked more to psychological distress, that popular belief in the spider connection held on for ages.
And even though the actual tarantula might be rarer now, maybe due to pesticides, the imagery and sort of echoes of Tarantism have lingered. Our sources suggest two main ways to look at it today: through academic study and through its modern, often modified expressions.
Ernesto de Martino's work, La Terra del Rimorso, is really seminal here. His team's fieldwork in 1959 looked at it culturally and historically. He moved beyond just psychological labels, defining tarantism as this blend of musical, dance, and color-based exorcism, with the tarantula acting as this powerful mythical symbol.
Right. He saw it not as primitive, but as a specific cultural response to really harsh living conditions, a kind of religion of remorse, using the spider to symbolize past traumas, which were then expressed and maybe worked through, using dance, music, song, color.
And the rhythm of the music, the pizzicat tarantata, was seen as absolutely vital for that emotional release, that catharsis. Now, DiMartino's work brought huge awareness, but it also had downsides, like attracting, well, exploitative tourism. Later research built on his foundations, looking at it from socioeconomic, medical, and anthropological angles.
Yeah, you see studies focusing on the tough economic reality or issues of female exploitation, even how the presence of the film crew might have influenced things. Medical views refined the psychological side, and anthropologists compared it to other healing rituals involving trance and possession.
Scholars like Lanternari saw tarantism as dealing with suffering beyond just clinical labels, using the body expressively. Others, like Lewis, saw it maybe as a kind of feminist subculture. Lapasade focused on the trance states, the idea of both exorcism, getting rid of the problem, and adorcism, kind of reconciling with the afflicting spirit, all through rhythmic interaction.
But interestingly, even as traditional Tarantism declined in its original home, Galatina, due to social changes, better healthcare, etc., we're seeing this kind of revival. The nuovi Tarantati, musicians, artists, dancers, feeling this pull towards the sounds, the steps, sometimes calling it an irresistible need to dance.
Lapasade saw this revival partly as a search for local identity. He even pointed to the music group Sud Sound System as modern curators of this tradition, blending reggae with Southern Italian music, bringing ritualistic elements into their performances.
Though we have to be cautious, right, comparing the historical Tarantati with the new ones, as we don't always know the full perspective of the Nuovi Tarantati. But its presence today in concerts, dance classes, festivals shows it's still culturally alive.
Absolutely. There are even attempts to blend its ritual aspects with modern psychology in therapeutic concerts, though professional therapists in the area urge caution about imposing that symbolism.
So academic research remains really crucial for understanding its ongoing life and transformations. It's complex, multifaceted, with this long, fascinating history covering not just healing dances, but also ritual combat and courtship dances, all under that umbrella of the tarantulas dance.
It really is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's just so clear that the history of music's role in healing is incredibly rich, layered, and, well, constantly evolving. From ancient ideas about cosmic harmony to these surprising links with esoteric thought and the complex cultural and medical views of the 19th century, this journey's revealed a lot of unexpected connections.
What really stands out, I think, is that this connection between music and well-being isn't some recent invention. It seems to be a deeply rooted human experience, interpreted and applied in countless different ways across time and across cultures.
This exploration really highlights how looking back at these historical perspectives can enrich our own understanding of music's power. It reminds us of this enduring human need to find comfort, solace, and healing through sound and rhythm.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. What might therapeutic music look like moving forward? How can we potentially draw on both this ancient wisdom, this long history we've discussed, and contemporary innovations to keep exploring and maybe harnessing the profound healing potential that music seems to hold?